So welcome back. I'm sure you enjoyed that little video clip and you're able to jot down each of the levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Interestingly, that video clip goes through each of the levels, and I think there's a real correlation there between Bloom's taxonomy, the levels of cognition, and looking at adapting the process. So when we're looking at process and we're looking at what questions to ask students, we wouldn't ask a child who could only give us very literal responses, any questions that regard analysis or synthesis. So as you're looking and talking and teaching children, it's really important to make sure that you can give them questions that they can answer, but also questions that involve thinking and cognition at their level. Now, adapting the content of the curriculum is a skill that teachers have, and that content looks at the topic first and then looks at scaffolding the content. It's easier if you can put the content into manageable units. So if you were going to teach a student a skill, just say, for example, the skill is learning to swim. You wouldn't teach them how to breathe in the water until you actually taught them how to jump into the water. So it might be you put a series of steps together, and we call this task analysis, and then quickly teach each individual skill and then put it all together in the process of swimming. Each child could be at a different level in learning to swim. There are some children who may be very scared still to jump into the water, and those children who can't kick their legs, and there are some students who have difficulty breathing, but they're all doing the lesson swimming, and they're all at different levels. Of course, that way of teaching to swim is modifying the learning task. If you found that there was a group of children who all didn't know how to jump into the water, you might call them level 1, and you would then teach them how to jump into the water, and you'd have a sequence of lessons, and you might have your level 5 swimming group that are up to the breathing part. So that's just one skill area, and that's learning to swim. There are also other ways of making adaptations by looking at our instructional material. When we're giving a lesson, it's important to simplify our language, to pre-teach any new material, modify any sentence structure. You wouldn't give a very complex sentence to a student who doesn't have a good grasp of processing language. You might use bullet points. You might enlarge some of the print for some students. Some students you would draw a diagram because they can't understand when you speak. They need a visual to go with it. You might give some students prompts or cues. All these things are where your instructional materials can be modified. But what about the product that we have from the lesson? Sometimes we give different expectations around the product. There are some students who say, well, when you answer this question, I want you to do an essay. Some students, I want you to make up a song. Some students, I want you to draw me a picture. Some students, I want you to do me a model. Some students, I would like you to just draw what you're thinking. It just depends upon the level of difficulty that you want for that student. It's also important that some of these things are negotiated with the student. We know that a student who says, I can't do it, then becomes, I won't do it. And the expectation of us as teachers is that we shouldn't be expecting exactly the same product from every student. And that goes with the homework too. If we're giving homework assignments, we should make sure that the homework is at the level that the student can do. But what about some of the teaching strategies that we use? Well, we know that sometimes we have to use direct instruction. Sometimes we have to use explicit instruction. Sometimes we have to stop a lesson and answer a student's question before we can go any further. It's really important to monitor the students' work, to ask them how they're doing something so that the student doesn't make a mistake. We know that when a student does something incorrectly, it takes 7 times as long to actually correct that mistake. We need to give feedback straight away. So it's really good that the teacher is walking around the lesson. A teacher should never be sat at a computer or at a desk. They should be always involved in the learning process. And of course, sometimes we have to pace our lessons differently. We have to have a very quick lesson, or sometimes we've got to make it very slow. Sometimes we've got to do slow, quick, slow, to make sure that the students are with us on this learning journey. The amount of assistance for each student can also change. Some students need a lot of assistance and some students need a small amount of assistance. So we have to be aware of students' level of assistance. And of course the assessment. Some students require a test, if we're using a test, to be constructed differently. Some tasks need to be shortened. Sometimes we've got to allow more time for some students. Sometimes we have to read the question to the student because they can't read the question, although they can do the task. Sometimes we've got to make the print bigger. Sometimes we've got to use a diagram. Sometimes we've got to modify the administration procedures. Sometimes we give different starting points and sometimes we give different finishing points. But overall, when we're planning objectives for our lessons, we have to keep in mind 3 things. We have to say all students will, some students will, and a few students may. Let me give you an example of a lesson that I watched not very long ago at Muswellbrook Primary School, and the lesson was called Shoebox Appeal Maths. And the question was about volume and calculating volume. So as the teacher began the lesson, they asked the students, well, what does volume mean? And why would we need volume? And then asked about length and width and height, so they understood those concepts. They were allowed to use their calculator and they were able to find the length, the height, the width and the volume of a soft toy, the unicorn, a block, a doll, a pencil and a sharpener, all the things that they would put into a Samaritan's shoebox for the Christmas appeal. And then they were asked, can you design a box that is big enough to hold 64 shoeboxes? And then asked, draw a diagram here showing the measurements of the box. And then for the high achievers, there was a picture of a shipping container, and it said the shipping container used to transport the shoeboxes is 2.5 meters high, 2.5 meters wide, and 6 meters long. Next question, how many shoeboxes can fit into this container? And then how did you work it out? Now that lesson was from students who are in years 3, 4, 5, and 6. You can see there are varying levels of difficulty in that assignment. It was all about Samaritan shoeboxes and about volume, but not every child in the class was expected to do every part of the assessment of the. And I thought that was really good that with that one lesson, there are so many children could engage with that lesson.